the outlook remains largely positive. There are a few key issues, though, that we're watching. One is the COVID restrictions at customs. So the market on the consumption side is good because most restaurants are back in business, and the consumption demand side remains strong, but the access for imported seafood in China remains slightly difficult because every week there are several importers, source companies, seafood companies in United States, India, Indonesia, who are being blocked from the market for periods of 1 week because traces of COVID is found on the packaging. This is involving frozen seafood now, frozen seafood imports. So a lot of suppliers to the market and some Chinese buyers are starting to limit their purchases because they're worried that the imported seafood containers won't get through the ports. So, for example, this week in a US company that sent squid into China was blocked from the market for 1 week. And obviously the seafood was destroyed. And also a Argentinian company. Now, most of the companies being blocked are Indian and Ecuadorian in more recent months because they're supplying large quantities of shrimp. So as I said, there is demand. The demand is solid in the domestic Chinese market at the consumer level, but the access to the market, it remains uncertain for imported seafood, and it's causing some worry among people shipping this seafood to China about access, about basically them losing money on the shipments. First thing you do is you speak in your home country. If you're a seafood exporter, speak to your Department of Agriculture or Fisheries, who regulates you, to find if you have a protocol with China for the particular species that you are shipping. And this is particularly if you're shipping live seafood. So the Chinese government and the exporting country government must sign a protocol that allows the shipments to go from that country into China. And this protocol is important because, for example, if it describes the procedures for export, but also it describes the conditions that a crab or that lobster must be in on arrival in China, so that, for example, the levels of mercurium or cadmium must be at a certain level to be acceptable to the Chinese side, or must be below a certain level. So the protocol is obviously crucial. You cannot export if there's no protocol between your government and the Chinese government. And then you've got to they find a distributor, an importer in China, because the importer will handle the procedures through customs. So your side, you'll have to provide a certificate of origin and a health certificate from the export side, and then the import procedures and taxes would be handled by your import partner. So typically, when you're shipping to China, unless you're a very large company with your own operation in China, your import partner would handle the procedures and advise you as well on other freight issues. You'll arrange the freight yourself depending on your relationship with the importer. So check if there's a protocol and find your import partner or buyer in China. They're the first two things you've got to do before, and that will satisfy the requirements that you'll need to ship. If it's frozen seafood in particular, frozen seafood has become a really hot issue in China, frozen imported seafood, because the Chinese government has suggested that COVID-19 may have entered China through cold chains, through, in particular, seafood, frozen seafood imports. So they have set up testing centers at all of the main ports at which frozen seafood arrives in China. It is quite an expensive procedure, because depending, it's per shipment. So if you, for example, send a shipment of whitefish or a shipment of frozen squid into China, well, your importer or you have to come to an arrangement, but it's approximately $200 per shipment. So a shipment might be half a container or a full container, and that has to be paid. And a certificate is given once the shipment is tested for COVID-19, a certificate to say that it has passed, or if it hasn't passed, it will be seized. And that certificate is then required at the retailer level in China. So the retailer must have this paperwork to say that this imported seafood was tested for COVID. Yeah, that's caused a lot of delays, and it's obviously caused extra cost as well. Again, it's typically the importer who's paying for this. Obviously, that either comes out of the exporter price or comes out of the end consumer price paid in China. Purchasers in China, purchasing import-export companies who typically bought the seafood and distributed it for you. There's a few big ones in Shanghai and Beijing and Guangzhou. But in recent years, more ports in China and airports are allowed to import seafood and food products. So that means you could, for example, fly maybe to Chongqing, or if it was a valuable live seafood product, you can now distribute into more internal cities. But e-commerce has become really important in the last 5 to 6, 7, 8 years in buying seafood. So you can come to an agreement with, for example, GFresh or JD.com, or of course Alibaba, which has both, which has Hema, which is both an online and an offline vendor of seafood in China. Alibaba also owns Tmall, which also sells seafood. Now they buy directly. They actually go around the world looking to purchase seafood at source, which they can sell on their online platforms in China. And because the margins on foreign seafood have been pretty good, so it's interesting for them. So depending on the species, it totally depends on the species. Some exporters would be selling a live oysters, for example, or live lobsters or live crabs. Sometimes they prefer to stick with the traditional importer distributor who is supplying restaurants directly, if they have a trust that there's no spoilage in the distribution, because obviously a live lobster is difficult to distribute through an online retailer. There's all kinds of issues of the last stage in the delivery to the customer's doorstep. But the big online retailers are handling this better than the other ones. So JD.com, GFresh, and Alibaba / Tmall Hema. So it is really about the species you have and the volumes you have. To distribute with the big online distributors, you typically have to have larger volumes, and they want a long-term relationship. Smaller volumes, it depends on the species, but they are more often distributed through the smaller importer companies. You can meet these, yes, at trade fairs. There are trade fairs in Boston, and used to be Brussels, now Barcelona, and in Hong Kong every year, as well as the big Chinese, the annual trade fair, which is held usually in late October, early November in Qingdao. Now, there are hundreds of Chinese companies, thousands who are present at the Qingdao fair, and there are hundreds who go to the Boston and the Brussels fairs. And it again depends on the product you have. More Chinese companies process both more of the Chinese processing companies who usually did contract processing are now also buying seafood for the domestic market. So there are just so many buyers out there. You have to decide who suits you best, depending on the type of seafood you have and the volumes you have. As I said earlier, that the consumption demand in China remains strong, and that's largely based on just income growth. I talked with some manufacturing companies who I've known for some time in the Shenzhen area this week, and we were just calculating between 2013 and now, the wages they're paying to their staff, their executive level staff, have more than doubled. So it's income growth that's really driving the Chinese demand for species like salmon and shrimp. Salmon is being eaten in Japanese dining and now also at home in China, which is a relatively new phenomenon. So the other interesting trend that's happening in China is that the government wants to shift the seafood produced locally away from exports and into the domestic market, because the prices are good there and you don't have the risk of currency and economic problems in export markets. So the Chinese demand will be, in the future, will be really for particular niche species, such as salmon, such as shrimp, because there isn't enough domestic production of shrimp to satisfy local demand. And there will always be demand for species that meet health needs of Chinese people, because Chinese seafood marketing companies like to use health and functionalities to market seafood. So for example, Chilean sea bass has become a popular species in China because it's being marketed as a baby food that's good for kids. And the Norwegian cod exporters, cod was always sent to China for processing and brought back. Now they're trying to sell it in the domestic market because they're saying that it's a good food for kids and elderly people. So there's all of these. The Chinese market really is really enthusiastic about the health benefits of particular seafood. Plus, then there are mass market species like pangasius, kind of catfish, which China is not able to produce at the volumes it needs itself. And that species is really important for mass market restaurant chains serving things like noodles and hot pot. hot pots, which are really growing around China as China urbanizes. So that's there are various niche needs in the market. The consumption remains strong. It's driven by income growth, but the Chinese are also trying to shift away from exporting seafood to selling it in the domestic market. So there will be a certain limitation in that respect to what the import needs will be.